Celine Dion. So I had this Canadian GSR, Kate, who loved Celine Dion, because all Canadians love Celine Dion, right? It's like a national thing. I hate Celine Dion. I find her singing really painful. It's just a taste thing, right? You may like her, but I don't care. So she would play this music. She was across the hall from me, and it would just drive me crazy, and I would make mistakes grading. But the other neighbor next door was this other German environmental economist, believe it or not, there's two of us in the department, who really liked Celine Dion, so he kept his door open when Kate would play his music, and he'd be more productive and write better papers. So the point I'm trying to make with this ludicrous Celine Dion example, that stance is pretty good, though. I gotta learn how to do that when I make an important point. The Celine Dion lesson here is whether something's a positive or a negative externality, meaning whether it makes somebody else's behavior makes you better or worse off, depends on your preferences for the thing, right? So if you like Celine Dion, if somebody else plays it, it might be a positive externality, it might make you better off. If you hate Celine Dion, it makes you worse off. So in many settings, it's not clear that every single, one type of activity is always a negative or always a positive externality. It might affect others in different ways. So another extreme example, I don't know where Jeff Perloff found this, but so generally, we all think that deforestation is a bad thing, right? Cutting down trees. Trees should stand and, do photosynthesis and look pretty and help watersheds and protect bobcat kittens and stuff like that. But, if you have really bad allergies, if somebody deforests, right, it might be a positive externality for you because all of a sudden you have no more allergies. Trees gone, no more pollen, right? So again, here, environmental destruction, the external costs, we generally think of environmental destruction are a negative externality because it impacts us negatively, but for some people it may be positively. So things can be positive, things can be negative, some things can be both, right? So anybody remember who this guy is? Okay, come on. If you don't know who Michael Jordan is, please leave, okay? Maybe the greatest player to ever play the game, right? So even in Germany, I knew who Michael Jordan was. Only we would call him Michael Jordan. Huh? So Michael Jordan's positive externalities. I'm on fire today. Michael Jordan's positive externalities, right? So I think the guy's a pretty cool guy. I've never seen him play live, but we would watch him, just destroy other teams, basically single-handedly. Scottie Pippen helped, right? But still, different story. So Jordan's presence, if you're thinking about the 1991-1992 regular season away games. Who gets ticket revenues, right? So if somebody comes to your stadium, at least in that time at the NBA, the local team gets the ticket revenues. So if the Chicago Bulls show up at your crappy team, right, who's going to go see a basketball game? Well, a lot more people than if it's not the Chicago Bulls coming to town, right? So people aren't coming to see your Will Ferrell in a sun costume type team, but they're coming to see the Chicago Bulls. So the Chicago Bulls playing in different towns actually raised ticket revenues at teams, away teams, by about $2.5 million, simply because people wanted to see Michael Jordan play in person. So Michael Jordan incurred this positive benefit to these other teams by simply showing up. If you add to it local TV advertising revenues, there were another $2.4 million there. Because sometimes they show local basketball games on TV, so advertisers have to pay more if it's a game that more people are going to watch. Michael Jordan doesn't get a penny. The Chicago Bulls don't get a penny from that. So these extra revenues from Michael Jordan showing up in places other than Chicago went to the home team rather than to the Chicago Bulls. It also, Jordan's presence increased national earnings. So if you compare TV advertising in seasons when Jordan played versus seasons when Jordan didn't play, there's some econometrician who figured out this number. It probably has a standard error the size of this building around it. But during the regular season, TV advertising revenues were $6.6 million higher when Michael Jordan was playing than when he wasn't playing. And during the playoffs, that was actually $14 million. Plus, people would buy clothing and videos, so hats and jackets and shirts. The number 23 was everywhere. That revenue of NBA properties went up by $15.1 million. Those revenues, the TV advertising that's not local and NBA, what's it called, merchandise, was distributed equally amongst teams. So the fact that Michael Jordan actually played the game raised revenues for everybody, and he didn't actually get part of that revenue. He made a sweet living, right? He had a great contract with the Bulls. He had, Air Jordans. Everybody had to have those sneakers. Can you still buy Air Jordans? Yeah? Are they still a popular sneaker to have? Yeah? All right. Yeah. So still, this much later, the guy's an old guy with a mustache now. But so he gets some private benefits, but there are these external benefits. So Jordan himself, if you look at the value of Jordan's positive externalities for one season, was about $40 million, right? Benefits that accrued to others and not Michael Jordan or the Bulls themselves. So this is, of course, I wouldn't call it a ridiculous example, but an extreme example. But I just wanted to convince you that externalities aren't this sort of fringe issue that affects a bunch of people like myself who I knit my own socks and I care about trees and I eat quinoa for lunch, all of which I do. I don't knit my own socks, but I would if I could. But externalities are everywhere, right? Both in positive, both in negative terms, and sometimes we think they're just an environmental issue, but they occur in things like traffic, right? So the fact that you wait for a really long time in traffic is when you go out on the road, you take up space, right? And one additional car on the road affects everybody else's speed that they can travel with. So the more cars are on the road, you slow everybody else down. So each additional car has something called a congestion externality because you're increasing everybody else's time to actually get to work. So it's not just an environmental thing. Externalities are everywhere. But let's think about the classical example here. So why do we make such a big deal out of externalities, right? I get it's beautiful stories that you can tell, but what I'm worried about here is there actually a welfare loss that I can figure out from due to the existence of an externality in a market? So let's think of the classical example here. The classical example is very, very simple. Let's think of a competitive market for power. Power is electricity, right, in layman's terms. And what you want to think about is that individual firms produce air pollution and electricity, which they do, right? So an individual firm puts a bunch of coal into a burner and then burns it, boils some water, that steam powers a turbine, and then something spins around and magically electrons come flying out the other side. They travel through the grid to your outlet and you then consume them. So power is generated in real time. It's not really storable at scale, so we do a lot of this. But in the process of producing electricity, these power generators, unless they're solar or wind or hydro, they produce air pollution. So here I want you to think of a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas-fired power plant, so basic fossil fuel type generator. And what you want to think about is that each megawatt, right? Megawatts are the units that electricity is measured in. Actually, watts are the units that electricity is measured in, and you just scale it up by kilo, mega, or giga. So each megawatt of power produces 1 unit of air pollution. So here I'm thinking of a production process where the more you produce, right, the more electricity you produce, the more pollution you produce. It's very similar to a car too, right? So whether I use a power plant here or a vehicle doesn't really matter. Each additional mile you drive, you produce 1 mile's worth of additional air pollution. It's external. I'm also going to assume for now that the only way to actually decrease the pollution coming out of the power plant is to decrease production. So this is a big assumption in the sense that, of course, we can do lots and lots of things other than ramping down production to decrease air pollution. In the case of power plants, for example, you can put something called an SCR, or a scrubber, on, where essentially you blow mist through the exhaust that comes out of the power plant, and a bunch of solids fall to the ground, and then you press the stuff and you turn it into drywall. So you can actually take pollution out of the power plant's exhaust without decreasing power production significantly. So you could think of this as one type of pollution, which is carbon dioxide, which is the biggest greenhouse gas. You can't scrub that out of power plants stacks at a reasonable cost right now. So more production, more pollution is what I'm thinking of here. So let's think about the following issue here. So far, we've always assumed that the firm, when it produces, right, bears the full cost of its production activities. So the firm, it hires labor, it rents capital, maybe it uses materials, but it pays the full price of its production activity. Well, that's what we call private costs, right? The firm actually dishes out dollars in order to buy the inputs to production. So this could be labor, capital, coal, water, whatever you want to think about that the firm has to pay off. But there's something else that often happens, which are these costs from externalities. So the total cost of production is actually the sum of these private costs and the external costs that the firm incurs while producing electricity. So what are you talking about, Max? What does air pollution do? Anybody? Bad for your health. Asthma. What else? What? Lung disease. You guys are thinking about health. What else? Climate change. What else? Anybody been at the Grand Canyon lately? Yeah, screws up views, right? If you have enough of it. Anybody been to, let's say, Mumbai lately? Delhi? Inner Mongolia? Screws up views really, really badly. It actually, in cases where it gets really, really bad, what you get is it deposits itself on buildings. It changes the color of buildings. Air pollution also does one thing. So not just CO2, but if you're thinking about things like NOx, SOx, sort of these particulate type things, they actually have indirect effects on local climate, right? So in India, for example, something I study, there's so much air pollution in the air that it actually forms essentially a carpet of air pollution that goes all the way from the Indian Ocean across the entire continent and then sort of wafts over to China and picks up even more air pollution. And that layer is so thick that what it does is it bounces back solar radiation into space, less sunlight reaches the ground, so it leads to cooling on the ground, and what you also get is you get less rainfall because now the oceans are cooler, so there's less evapotranspiration, and the chemistry of these particles works in a way that the droplets never get big enough to actually turn into rain. So air pollution does all kinds of bizarre things in terms of health, in terms of visibility, in terms of impacts on local climate. If you're thinking about sulfur-type pollutants, you get things like your rain all of a sudden turns more acidic rain falls onto soils and kills roots of trees. So air pollution overall is pretty bad. Do firms pay for the use of, let's say, the atmosphere, the soil, and so on to deposit their air pollution? The answer to that I'm not going to ask you because that's unfair. In some settings, yes, right? So if you're in the Chicago area, for example, it's a regulated environment where you do pay for the use of the atmosphere. But in most settings, you don't, right? We, in terms of greenhouse gases, for those of us who don't live in California, Europe, or places where there's an actual regulatory process in place, you use the atmosphere, the water, and the air as a free dumping ground. So what you're doing is you cause external costs by combusting fossil fuels. Kids missing days of schools, tourist visibility at the Grand Canyon is impaired. Farmers in India have lower crop yields because of climate and direct pollution effects, but you don't pay for that, right? So these external costs are the quantification of the costs of your activity that are not borne by yourself, but that are borne by others. So the total social cost of your production activities should be the sum of your private costs of production, labor costs, capital costs, costs for materials, and the damages or the costs you cause society through your activities that you don't actually pay for, right? So what we economists argue, and I will show you this in the most convincing graph you have ever seen in your life in a second, is that by not having firms internalize, meaning accounting for these external costs, firms will produce more pollution than is socially efficient, and welfare won't be maximized. So this gets me to a point, and we're going to draw this and get super techy and nerdy in a second, but this gets me to a point that I think is really interesting, where as an undergrad, I applied to be an environmental engineer, right? And then I figured out that they build bridges, so I became an environmental scientist, and I took a lot of these environmental studies classes, and a lot of my friends were just convinced that the optimal level of pollution for all pollutants is zero, right? Mankind should not pollute. Economists would disagree with this statement in many settings, right? Because when you consume something, there's a benefit from consumption, right? So what we would argue is that we should weight the marginal benefit from consumption against the total social cost, or the marginal social cost of consuming that unit, right? If the marginal social cost of that unit, meaning the total cost to society of you consuming that one more unit, is bigger than the marginal benefit to you, we probably shouldn't produce that unit and you shouldn't consume it. But for many, many things, the marginal benefit of consumption is much, much bigger than the social marginal cost of producing that. So we should actually see consumption of those goods. So economists, for many pollutants, would argue there's an optimal level of pollution, and we will see this in a graph in a second, right? This is where we're really unpopular. I don't go to my environmental studies reunions anymore because I've gone to the dark side, and how dare you, Max, right? But I find this a convincing, from an economics point of view, a convincing argument that if you account for the full cost of production, weigh benefits against each cost, against costs. There's enough work to do here where we do not charge firms the full cost of production, meaning we're not making them pay for the external costs, that we can move towards what's socially optimal for a long time without forbidding everyone to breathe, right? Because CO2 is a pollutant, and I'm sorry to tell you, you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out CO2. So zero pollution, you got to leave the planet. Enjoy Mars, all right? I'm being sarcastic here, but if you take that argument to an extreme, that's where you'd have to go, all right? So private costs versus social costs. Social costs are the sum of private costs and external costs. Private costs are just the firm's costs that we've seen so far in the class. Okay, so what about these externalities? So let's draw a picture here. Hold on. Here we go. Sorry, I just drew it earlier, so it's nice and pretty. Here we go. My printer doesn't print out these slides with the drawings on them, unfortunately. Okay, you don't care, as you should. Quantity, price. So what we could think about here is something pretty simple. Okay, if we think about a single firm, let me just check something for 1 second here. I'm going to draw this differently. So think of the marginal benefit of consumption as the demand curve here. That is the marginal benefit from consumption So what you can think of here is your maximum willingness to pay for an additional unit is exactly equal to your marginal benefit from consumption, right? So you're willing to pay for an additional unit exactly as much as you think the benefit of consumption is from that additional unit, right? So this is the example of the pint. If I walk into the bar, I think my marginal benefit in terms of consumption, when my emotions just get all calm after I've had that first sip, is worth $30, right? I'm only forced to pay the $4, but my marginal willingness to pay for that additional pint is exactly equal to what I think the marginal benefit from that pint is, all right? So I'm going to call this demand curve, what we've called demand so far, and equate that to something called marginal benefit from consumption, okay? Just make the language a little bit easier. Now, I'm going to draw my supply curve. Ooh, this would be terrible notation. Hold on, let me not do that notation. The curve is right, but my notation's bad. So this is supply, which is the aggregate sum of the marginal cost curves. Right? So you can think of this as the aggregate marginal cost. So what do firms do? If they're left alone, they do this, right? Supply, meaning aggregate marginal cost, is equal to demand, which we can call marginal benefit, and this is what firms would do if you leave them alone. That seems pretty dandy, Max. I've drawn this 4,000 times. Do not bore me to tears. Show me something new. Here we go. Now what I'm going to argue is that for each unit of production, there's a constant external cost. So each additional unit of production is going to cause, let's say, $5 of external cost. So one more unit of air pollution causes $5 worth of damages in terms of lost visibility, lost health benefits, and whatever other damages we can come up with. So the marginal external cost, let's do this in red, is constant here. So for each additional unit, that's the marginal external cost. So you produce one more unit of output, you cause $5 additional worth of damage. So supply is the sum of the marginal cost curves. This is private marginal cost, right? It's the cost of labor plus the cost of capital plus the cost of whatever else, but these are your private marginal costs. It's the supply curve we've derived so far. There were no external costs in there. So what I'm going to argue is that social marginal cost is exactly equal to private marginal costs plus the external costs. So for each unit produced to the private marginal cost on the upward sloping curve here, I'm simply going to add the external marginal cost or marginal external cost to get to social marginal cost, okay? So at each point here, I'm simply going to add two squares. Okay, where's a good point to add two squares? Here. So the social marginal cost is here. Okay, and the distance between these two is always marginal external cost. Actually, call it external marginal. You can call it either way. Okay, so the black line here tells you what private marginal costs are. The social ones, the true marginal cost of production, is simply the sum of private and external marginal costs. So the true marginal cost of society is the full cost of production, is the red line here, not the black line right here. So what's the socially optimal output level? The socially optimal output level is, I wish I had a green pen, but this stupid thing stole my green pen from me. Okay. The socially optimal output level, we'll do yellow because that sort of looks green on the screen, is going to be Q double star and P double star. But Max, hang on a second, right? Are you selling me, what's it called? There's an American expression for this. Is it called snake oil? Is that something like something where you're selling something with healing properties and it has no healing properties? So are you selling me snake oil? Do you have some sort of agenda here where you're just selling me a fancy model and you are some sort of lefty who's trying to, mess with industry and really stick it to the energy industry and those? No, okay? That's not it. What I'm arguing here is we know that if these are my marginal costs and this is my demand curve, the socially optimal point is where supply equals demand, right? We've shown this 1,000 times. But what I'm arguing now is that the supply curve does not reflect the full opportunity cost of production because you're incurring all this external cost here, and the true cost is actually higher. So all I'm saying here is, if we're thinking about what maximizes welfare, it's where total cost of production in the marginal sense here is reflected in my marginal cost curve here. So both external and private costs. Okay, so Max, that seems really, really interesting. But how can this be? Okay, are you ready for the welfare table? This is where it's going to get a little bit harder now. Okay. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and external cost. EC stands for external cost, not the delicious ice cream place on College. Spelled differently, too. Lame joke. Okay. Did something just move? Something moved. This moved. That's good enough. Okay. So I'm going to look at what happens at Q star versus what happens at Q double star, and then we're going to check out welfare. Oh, this whole thing moved. Demand moved, too. I can fix you. Here we go. Look at that. You're not the boss of me, Bill Gates. Here we go. So let's figure out what welfare is at Q star, P star, and let's figure out what welfare is at Q double star, P double star. The pizza slices are a bit crazy in this one, okay? So just bear with me. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Hold on, do I need anything else? Yep, I need H. We skip I, J.